Paris, once celebrated as the City of Light, is now burning with smoke, protests, and anger. The familiar picture of romantic boulevards has turned into a battlefield of frustration. French citizens are not just marching against rising costs of living, not only because of immigration pressures, but also because they feel their nation is losing the global standing it once commanded. And at the very center of this storm stands President Emmanuel Macron, once hailed as the fresh face of France, now branded by many as a leader in decline. Less than a decade after taking office, Macron is being called by a chilling title, the President of Humiliation. Personal scandals have turned him into a punchline, while on the international stage, France's greatest legacy in Africa is collapsing piece by piece. The question is not only whether he can survive politically at home, but how a man who once promised renewal became the symbol of both domestic unrest and international failure. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, a country once dismissed as small and impoverished, a young leader named Ibrahim Traoré has flipped the entire board. He expelled French troops, tore up long-standing agreements, and reignited a spirit of sovereignty across the Sahel. His bold defiance has not only reshaped his own nation, but also inspired neighboring countries to follow. In doing so, Traoré struck directly at the very foundation of Macron's foreign policy, France's dominance in Africa. So is Africa's rise the true reason Paris is now trembling, and is Ibrahim Traoré writing a new chapter in history at the very moment Emmanuel Macron fades into political darkness? Stay with me as we dig deeper into this turning point that connects Paris and Ouagadougou, power and resistance, decline and rebirth. And if you believe that what is happening in Burkina Faso and across Africa is a story the mainstream media doesn't want you to hear, then subscribe and share this video, because truth matters more than headlines. When we look at France today, it is impossible to separate the chaos on the streets from the unraveling of its power abroad. Protesters may chant about inflation, jobs, and immigration, but beneath all of it lies a deeper truth. France is being shaken not only by internal fractures, but by the collapse of its influence in Africa. This is the central event that defines Emmanuel Macron's presidency, the downfall of a French empire that lasted for centuries, now being dismantled before our eyes. From the very beginning of his presidency in 2017, Macron tried to strike a delicate balance. He spoke boldly in public, declaring that colonialism was a crime against humanity. He promised a new era of equality with Africa, one in which Paris would turn the page on the dark chapter of France-Afrique, the informal system of political and economic dominance that allowed France to keep its grip long after official independence. On paper, these words sounded revolutionary. For a moment, it seemed that a French leader might finally acknowledge Africa as an equal partner rather than a dependent child. But policy is louder than rhetoric. Despite his progressive speeches, Macron doubled down on France's military presence in the Sahel. He insisted that French forces were a shield against jihadist terrorism, and that without France, countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso would collapse under extremist violence. To many Africans, this sounded less like protection and more like occupation. They saw French soldiers not as liberators, but as an extension of colonial rule. The contradiction could not last forever. By the early 2020s, public opinion in West Africa had shifted dramatically. Young Africans in particular, a generation raised on social media with access to global conversations about sovereignty and justice, rejected Paris's paternalistic narrative. They no longer accepted the idea that France had the right to dictate their security, their economies, or their politics. Protests erupted in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. Across the Sahel, the cry grew louder: France must go. The turning point came in Burkina Faso. In 2022, a young army captain named Ibrahim Traoré seized power in a coup that stunned the world. At just 34 years old, he embodied the frustration of a new generation unwilling to bow to Paris. Traoré wasted no time. He expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, terminated decades-old military agreements, and accused Macron directly of humiliating Africans. His words carried the weight of history, but his actions carried even more. Burkina Faso went further. It began nationalizing parts of its natural resources, gold, oil, and other minerals that had long flowed cheaply into French and Western markets. It cut ties with French companies that controlled airlines and infrastructure. Suddenly, France's lifeline to critical resources and economic footholds in West Africa was under threat. Macron did himself no favors. In 2025, during a speech to African leaders, he made a statement that would become infamous. He claimed Africans had forgotten to say thank you to France for its sacrifices in the Sahel. To African ears, this was not just arrogance, it was an insult. It confirmed what many already believed: Macron's vision of partnership was never about equality, but about maintaining control. Traoré's response was electrifying. He shot back that Africans did not need lectures, they needed freedom, dignity, and their own path. His defiance inspired Mali and Niger, who soon followed Burkina Faso in cutting ties with Paris. Military bases that had stood for decades were dismantled. French troops, once seen as immovable, packed up and left. For Macron, this was not just a diplomatic defeat, it was the unraveling of France's entire identity as a global power. For centuries, Paris had treated Africa as its backyard, a source of resources and influence. Now, under Macron's watch, that backyard was slipping away. At the very moment he tried to present himself as a reformer, Africa turned its back, led by a young soldier who represented everything Macron could not control. This is the central event: France, once an empire reduced to retreat. Macron, once the face of renewal, now mocked as the president who promised progress but delivered humiliation. And at the heart of it all, Ibrahim Traoré, the man who dared to tell France no more. The true climax of Emmanuel Macron's downfall came not in the streets of Paris, but on a stage where his own words lit the fire that consumed his reputation. In 2025, Macron stood before African leaders and declared that the continent had forgotten to say thank you to France for its sacrifices in the Sahel. To him, it was perhaps a careless remark, an attempt to remind the world of France's role in fighting terrorism. To Africa, it was a slap in the face. It exposed everything Africans had suspected for decades, that behind the promises of equality, France still expected gratitude, obedience, and submission. That single phrase became the spark that set off a wave of fury. African media replayed his words endlessly. Commentators called it arrogance. Ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger called it an insult to their dignity. Even leaders who once cooperated with France could not defend him. Macron's comment crystallized the resentment of a generation that was already fed up with Paris. It was Ibrahim Traoré who gave that resentment a voice. The 34-year-old leader of Burkina Faso did not mince words. He accused Macron of humiliating Africans, of pretending to be a partner while acting like a master. More importantly, Traoré matched his words with action. He expelled French troops, ordered the closure of military bases, and ripped up security agreements that had defined Franco-African relations for decades. His defiance was not just political theater, it was a real physical dismantling of France's presence in West Africa. The reaction across the region was electric. In Mali and Niger, leaders took inspiration from Burkina Faso and soon demanded French forces leave their soil as well. What had begun as one small country's rebellion turned into a regional earthquake. France, the former colonial giant, was now being told to pack its bags by the very nations it once controlled. And the shockwaves did not stop there. French companies that had dominated African industries for decades suddenly found themselves unwelcome. Airlines were forced out, mining contracts were cancelled, oil and gold concessions were renegotiated under new terms that favored African governments instead of French corporations. For the first time in living memory, Paris was not dictating the rules, Africa was. In France, the backlash was swift. Macron's critics at home accused him of presiding over the greatest collapse of French influence since World War II. Newspapers ran headlines mocking him as the president who had lost Africa. Political opponents called him arrogant, naive, and incapable of defending France's interests. For a country that had long prided itself on its global role, the humiliation was unbearable. Meanwhile, international players wasted no time stepping into the vacuum. Russia and Turkey signed new agreements with Sahel states. China expanded its investments. Some African leaders even declared they would rather build their own security forces than ever again rely on France. The message was clear: Africa had options, and Paris was no longer at the center of them. The United States watched with unease. Washington had hoped France could serve as a stabilizing force in the Sahel, allowing America to focus elsewhere. But with Paris retreating, the US suddenly faced a dilemma: step in and risk being rejected just as France had been, or stay back and watch Russia and Turkey gain ground. For the first time in decades, the West was no longer the default partner in Africa. What made the climax so powerful was not only Traoré's defiance, but the symbolism it carried. Here was a young man barely half Macron's age, standing up to one of Europe's most powerful leaders and saying, "Enough." His voice echoed the frustrations of millions, and his actions proved that the old order could indeed be broken. Macron's downfall reached its peak in this moment of confrontation. His words "thank you" meant to elevate France instead revealed the very arrogance that destroyed its empire. And Traoré's response, bold, unapologetic, decisive, became the rallying cry of a new Africa. This was the climax. A French president exposed, a young African leader celebrated, and an entire continent awakening to its own power. The reactions both in Africa and France left no doubt. The age of Paris as Africa's master was over. The collapse of France's influence in the Sahel did not remain an abstract debate about foreign policy. It cascaded into everyday life, reshaping politics, economics, and society, both in France and across Africa. The consequences were immediate, tangible, and deeply emotional, a reminder that geopolitics is never just about governments. It is about people. In Paris, Macron's humiliation abroad quickly translated into unrest at home. Citizens were already furious about rising prices, stagnant wages, and mounting immigration challenges. Now they saw their president mocked internationally as the man who had lost Africa. To many French citizens, this was more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a blow to national pride. For centuries, France had defined itself as a global power. Losing its last stronghold in Africa felt like losing a part of its identity. Protesters on the streets waved banners, not just against economic austerity, but against Macron personally, calling him weak, arrogant, and disconnected from reality. Within the French political class, rivals circled like vultures. Opposition parties accused Macron of betraying France's legacy and failing to protect its strategic interests. His approval ratings sank. Even allies whispered that his gamble on Africa had backfired disastrously. What was meant to be a legacy of reform was now being written as a legacy of decline. But while Macron faltered, something very different was happening in Africa. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the expulsion of French troops and companies was celebrated as a national rebirth. For decades, ordinary citizens had watched foreign soldiers patrol their streets and foreign corporations siphon off their resources. Now, for the first time in generations, they felt ownership of their own destiny. In Burkina Faso especially, Ibrahim Traoré's reforms reshaped daily life. Mines that had once been operated by French corporations were reclaimed with profits redirected to national projects. Local airlines, once overshadowed by French carriers, began hiring young Africans to staff and manage fleets. Farmers who had long sold their crops at unfair prices to foreign markets now spoke of state-led initiatives to secure better deals. The streets of Ouagadougou buzzed, not with resentment but with a cautious pride. Their government was finally acting in their interest. This new sense of sovereignty came with challenges. Nationalizing industries required expertise and infrastructure that did not appear overnight. Yet even the struggles were viewed differently. Instead of blaming Paris or Washington, citizens began debating how they themselves could solve these problems. The political conversation shifted from dependency to accountability. On a broader political level, the rejection of France reshaped alliances. The African states of the Sahel increasingly cooperated with one another, finding strength in solidarity. Leaders emphasized regional solutions rather than waiting for instructions from Europe. For the first time in decades, Africa was not speaking with a French accent, it was speaking with its own. The symbolism mattered as much as the policies. Images of French soldiers boarding planes and leaving African soil were broadcast across the continent. For young Africans, it was proof that resistance was not futile. For older generations, it was vindication after decades of humiliation. Across the Sahel, songs, slogans, and murals celebrated sovereignty with Ibrahim Traoré's name often painted alongside those of independence heroes like Thomas Sankara. Meanwhile, in France, the consequences deepened. With access to fewer African resources, energy costs rose. French companies that had long depended on African contracts faced layoffs. Politicians who once boasted of France's global reach were left scrambling to explain how the country had been eclipsed by Russia, Turkey, and even homegrown African initiatives. The humiliation was no longer distant, it was felt in French households, in rising bills and shrinking opportunities. The civil and political consequences were therefore twofold. In France, a loss of pride, resources, and stability. In Africa, a surge of dignity, hope, and responsibility. One nation's downfall became another's rebirth. And at the heart of it all was the symbolic reversal of roles. France, once the master, now on the defensive, and Africa, once the dependent, now in control of its own future. The fall of France's influence in Africa did not unfold in isolation. It sent shockwaves across the world, forcing Washington, Moscow, Ankara, and Beijing to rethink their strategies. For the United States in particular, the events of 2025 were a wake-up call. America had long relied on France to act as a stabilizing force in the Sahel, allowing Washington to focus its attention on the Middle East and Asia. But with French troops expelled and French companies dismantled, that safety net disappeared almost overnight. In Washington, policymakers found themselves facing an uncomfortable dilemma. Should the United States step into the vacuum left by Paris, risking the same rejection that France had endured, or should it stand back and allow others, especially Russia and Turkey, to fill the gap? Many American analysts warned that if the US tried to assume France's role, it would meet the same resistance. After all, the anger was not only directed at France, it was directed at the entire Western system of dominance. To young Africans, Washington and Paris often looked like two sides of the same coin. Russia, by contrast, seized the opportunity with both hands. Moscow deepened its security and might-wing partnerships in the region, presenting itself as an ally against Western arrogance. Turkey followed a similar path, offering military cooperation and infrastructure investments. Even China, which had already established a strong economic presence, expanded its influence by financing new projects and signing trade agreements. The message to Paris and Washington was clear. Africa was no longer dependent on any one power. It had choices, and it was exercising them. Global media outlets framed the story in different ways. In Europe, headlines focused on Macron's humiliation and the collapse of Françafrique. Commentators described it as the most significant geopolitical retreat for France since the Algerian War of Independence. In Russia and Turkey, the coverage was triumphant, portraying the Sahel as a new frontier where Western hegemony was finally being dismantled. In Africa itself, the narrative was entirely different. It was not about France's loss, but about Africa's gain. For many Africans, this was the long-awaited moment when sovereignty was more than a slogan, it was reality. The United States could not ignore these shifts. American think tanks began publishing reports on the Sahelian realignment, warning that Washington risked losing influence in a region critical for counterterrorism and resource access. Yet there was also recognition that traditional strategies would no longer work. If the U.S. wanted a role in Africa's future, it would have to be on Africa's terms, a partnership, not an occupation. At the United Nations, African diplomats became more assertive. Backed by the momentum of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, they demanded greater representation, a louder voice in global governance, and respect for their independence. What once seemed like isolated grievances now took the form of a coordinated push for reforming international institutions. For France, the global perspective was particularly painful. Allies who once relied on Paris to manage African affairs began bypassing it, negotiating directly with African capitals. Macron, who had dreamed of being remembered as the president who renewed France, was instead being remembered as the one who lost Africa. For the United States and the broader West, the lesson was sobering. The age of dictating terms to Africa was over. A continent once seen as dependent had shown it could push back against one of Europe's strongest powers and win. Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was not just a national story, it was a signal to the world that Africa was no longer playing by colonial rules. France is burning, but the flames are not only on the streets of Paris. They are also in the pages of history, consuming the last remnants of an empire that once stretched across Africa. Emmanuel Macron will be remembered not as the leader who renewed France, but as the one who presided over its humiliation. His downfall was not caused solely by protests or scandals, but by the defiance of nations that once lived in his country's shadow. Burkina Faso, under the young and fiery leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, became the spark that lit a regional revolution. By expelling French troops, reclaiming resources, and tearing up unfair agreements, Traoré shattered the illusion that Paris still held Africa in its grip. What followed was more than geopolitics. It was a rebirth of dignity for millions of Africans who had waited generations for the day when sovereignty meant true control over their land, their skies, and their future. But with every turning point comes a warning. History tells us that when empires lose control, they rarely do so quietly. France's retreat from Africa may provoke desperation attempts to cling to influence through covert operations, economic sabotage, or even political manipulation. The same forces that resisted independence in the 20th century may reappear in the 21st under new disguises. Africa's path will not be smooth. Corruption, foreign interference, and internal divisions still threaten to undo what has been gained. And yet the broader truth cannot be denied: the balance of power is shifting. For the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world, the message is clear. The age of Western dominance in Africa is coming to an end. Whether that end leads to chaos or to a new era of African-led development depends on the choices made today. For Americans watching this story unfold, there is another question. Can we truly respect Africa's sovereignty, or will we repeat the mistakes of France by demanding gratitude instead of offering partnership? And for Africans themselves, can leaders like Ibrahim Traoré resist the temptations of corruption and hold fast to the vision of independence, or will history repeat itself once again? This is not just about Macron or even France. It is about a world in transition, a world where Africa is rising and where its young leaders are no longer asking for permission to lead. So I ask you, do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should we support someone else to succeed him? Your thoughts matter, because this is not only Africa's story, it is a global one. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The fire in Paris may one day be extinguished, but the fire in Africa has only just begun to burn.